Hi there, I'm John from CNCKing.com, and today we make a custom fire pit for my backyard. The problem with fire pits nowadays is that whenever you buy one, you're going to buy it again in 2 or 3 years. They're all made with really thin sheet metal, and they just don't last, especially for the fires that I do here with all the scraps from CNCKing. So I decided, now that I've got more into welding and I've spent 1.5 years learning how to weld properly, it's time to actually start making projects that I could actually use in the house, in the home, and beyond. In this case here, it's a fire pit. The thickness of the steel here, it's hot rolled mild steel, 3/16. So it's maybe about 3 to 4 times thicker than what you'd get at a big box store right off the bat. It's a lot heavier as well. And the legs you see down here, those are 2-inch by 2-inch tubing with a 1/8 wall. Again, hot rolled mild steel. And the inside of the grate here, as you see here, that is also hot rolled mild steel. It's 1.5 inches thick and 2 inches by 2 inches. The overall fire pit is 15 inches tall. The squareness of the top is 3 feet, and the bottom is a little bit less than 2 feet. So this can hold a ton of wood, and I'm not worried about it burning or rotting down or so forth. So here we are plasma cutting the sheet of hot rolled mild steel, 3/16 thick, and the size of the sheet that you see there is a half sheet, which is 48 inches square. Now the nice thing about plasma cutting is that it's a very fast process compared to water jet cutting, and the kerf is very minimal. In this case here, I really enjoy the kerf that it actually creates over, let's say, a laser, because the laser is almost 90 degrees straight down, while with the laser there's a little bit of an angle to it, and I think that adds a little bit more detail, I guess free detail, to the finished fire pit, which is what I wanted for this project here. Now plasma cutting is a really efficient process. There's a lot of sparks and lots of fire, and what you notice if you look at the bottom of the sheet, you can see big flames shooting down. So it's just instantly vaporizing the metal, and there's lots of heat and smoke generated from that. And I wish they had transparent steel, because that's where the real fireworks happen. And you never really get to see it too much unless you're looking at the holes that I've cut out with the plasma cutter, because that's where you have the huge fire shooting down and flames and everything. It's just great. So after this is done, then I just clean up the parts a little bit, and then right away go ahead and start welding it. So the nice thing about plasma cutting is that, laser as well, is that once you're done that process, there's very little cleanup to do in order to go right into welding. Now you'll notice that in this video here, I use just 2 processes, flux core arc welding and shield metal arc welding. So flux core welding is actually, when you see me not use this here. So these are rods, and they can be had like basically any size, any thickness, any sort of properties that you want. So if you want to do stainless steel with this, you want to do aluminum, you want to do mild steel, you want to do titanium, you want to do whatever you want to do. You can actually do it just with stick. But it takes a bit of skill to get to the hang of it. It's taken me quite a long time in school to get to really understand it properly. And it's very, very flexible. The only downside with it is that if you're doing a little bit of welding, you don't have to scratch or go like this to get the arc going, and then you start to weld. But if you're putting things together like this here and you're trying to stick it together, it's not a very efficient process, because you're spending a lot of time chipping off the back, going ahead, striking an arc, making like maybe, what, a 1/4 inch, and then you have to redo it all over and over again. Well, if you're using a gun, which I can't reach right now. Well, if you're using a gun, all you do is point it and you shoot. And that's flux core arc welding. Now the reason why I'm using flux core in this is because I don't need any gases. And if you're using, flux core is technically a MIG process, but I'm using the gasless version of it, so it's self-shielding. So the nice thing about that is I don't need any gases. So it's basically this in wire format that I just point and shoot and do my tack welds. Now once I do my tack welds, then I sort of position things a little bit better, so I make sure everything's dead on to the spec that I need it to be for this process here, or this project. And then after that, I go ahead and do welds. Now you'll notice also that I do full welds everywhere. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, I enjoy the practice. To me, doing this stick welding or sheet metal arc welding is actually quite relaxing to me. It just slows down. It's just, you know, relax. And the more of that I could do, great. It's great after work. And the other reason for it is because this would be outside. So it'd be lots of rain and snow and all the other stuff going onto this. And if there's any sort of gaps or holes, that's where water seeps in and starts to rot. If I have a full weld everywhere, the water will just go down and go through the holes at the bottom of the fire pit. So in that way, I think it's actually going to be more of a self-cleaning fire pit. At least that's my idea. And we'll see if that becomes reality. Now for this here, the reason why I have this removable is because if you want to use a garden hose or whatever to clean it out, you could do that. This also protects the bottom of the fire pit because you have all the heat goes up, right? But there's also some heat and stuff that goes at the bottom, and that's what gets rotted out first because of that, because there's a temperature differential whenever you use it. So let's go ahead and start welding this together. Regardless of the machine I use to cut metal, whether it's water jet, laser, or plasma, it doesn't really matter. There's always some dross on the underside. So what I'm doing here is I'm removing the dross from the underside. And you can tell it's the underside because you see that yellowish, sort of smoky stuff on it. That's the underside. The top side doesn't really have that because the smoke goes downwards basically, and it comes back up a little bit like a water jet, but not as bad. And as a result, that's why you have that. Now the dross isn't really too much of an issue. I could weld through it, but when you're trying to do a proper fit up, you want everything to be, you know, meet perfectly, and the dross can just be like a little clump of metal, and it just stops that from happening. Now I looked all over for paint for this project here, and the highest rated paint I could find was this stuff here. It's good for 2000 degrees Fahrenheit, or roughly a little over 1100 degrees Celsius. And we'll see how long that lasts. So that's why the inside, you know, a little bit spotty. You just want to see what the reaction is to the fire to it over time. And this is all, again, fully painted everywhere. The grade on the inside is just normal enamel paint. And the enamel paint, I expect it to not last very long at all. So that's just typical house paint you could get anywhere else. So just for visuals, that's why I have two different color of paint. But I expect this to be back to mild steel look. And I expect this, well, we'll find out how long it lasts. Trying to figure out how to put this fire pit together for tack welding was a little bit of a challenge. At first I thought, okay, I'll lay it flat and I'll bring the parts up and I'll hold it and I'll use the gun to just sort of tack weld it real quick before it falls back down. And that was just a nightmare. There's no way that would work all by yourself. So what I thought about is, why don't I do it the reverse? And it actually worked pretty well. I put some blocks, as you can see, on the underside of the top, and I just lay it there, do my squaring and so forth, because, you know, if this is not square, nothing else on the whole project will be square. So I have to make sure everything's dead on, and that's what I was able to do. You know, that's just a carpenter's square that I've been using for years in the shop, and I use it mostly for woodworking, but it comes out really handy for metalworking as well. Now this is a fixture table, and technically you buy a bunch of fixtures to fit on there to do that more efficiently, and I'll be building that up over time. But for now, I'm just using, you know, basically woodworking tools to hold things together while I tack weld them. So what you see is the little dabs of metal that are happening, and this is called flux core arc welding, and it doesn't need a shielding gas. That's the kind of wire. You can get flux core arc welding with gas or without gas, and I got the one without gas because I don't see the point of using flux core arc welding with a gas on top of that. It seems kind of redundant to me. Then you might as well just do gas metal arc welding. Anyways, so once everything's tack welded and gotten into where I want it to be, after that, what I want to do is look over it and make sure if there's any modifications that need to be done. And of course, there were some modifications needed to be done, because even when you're tack welding, things can move just a little bit and you don't notice it. So then you go ahead and put the square back, and then you go, oh, I got to fix this part. Now for the grate that you see here, it's actually quite heavy. It's just angle iron that I flux core arc welded. And the purpose of this is a fewfold. I already mentioned that it protects the bottom of the fire pit, but it also offsets the stuff. So if you want to start a fire, you can actually put the paper underneath, and light it up. Usually you get holes all around. And the wood would stay on the top of the grate. I'll put it over here so it's easier to see. So basically you could put the paper and other consumables or combustibles underneath here and put the wood and the logs and the other stuff up here, and the fire will go through and start the fire that way. The other reason, of course, is to protect the bottom of the fire pit. So when you have embers and that kind of stuff building up here, there's a lot of heat that just sits there, and that's what ends up destroying a fire pit, at least at the base. So this is a bit of an offset. The other reason why I have it like this is because it's removable, so I can take it out, put it back in whenever I want. If I want to change the design of it or so forth, it's pretty easy to do. But I also have air holes at the bottom of the fire pit, which I'll show you. Just gonna move the rod. These things are actually somewhat fragile. So you can see here I have holes. And the purpose of those holes, again, as I mentioned, is the self-washing idea I have. But it also gives a lot of ventilation, which is important for a fire. If you want to put a fire out, make sure you have no ventilation, and it's going to go out no matter how much consumables and stuff you have in there. So my idea is the air will come down here and go upwards like this here and create a pretty good fire. So we'll find out if that's true. And now for the fun part, at least that's what I consider it, is the shield metal arc welding. And I want to make sure I have a proper ground. I could technically just use the ground, the clamp that you see on top of the fire pit. I could put that against the table and I'll have a fine ground. But I found for shield metal arc welding especially, having a proper ground really helps a lot. And that's why I have it at the top there. And throughout the whole process, I always try to have the ground as close to where I'm welding as possible. Just the electricity has to travel that much less to complete the circuit, which is basically what welding is. It's a casting process, but I'm completing the circuit. So the more I can do that, the better. Now, the disadvantage, as you can see with shield metal arc welding or stick welding, is that the rod eventually, gets dissolved. It gets consumed. And because of that, you need to grab another rod and another rod and another rod. So for production settings, that's why employers don't like using this process, because it takes a lot more time and you can't just keep going for hours and hours straight. You always have a consumable, you wear it out or you burn it off, then you need to grab another one and grab another one. Now this is not structural or CWB or any of these sort of high-end sort of requirements, but I am using 7018 for this process. It's a 1/8 rod. And the reason why I'm using 7018 over, let's say, 7014 is because I don't need the deep penetration into the metal to do the weld properly here. I basically need something that melts the metal around it and bonds it properly, but I don't need to push through any sort of rust or paint or anything like that. This is basically clean metal. And if I were to leave it in the shop for maybe a couple months or a couple of years, it'll start having rust on it. And then, of course, I'd clean off the rust, but then I'd move to 7014 rods just to have that extra protection and the extra flexibility that offers me. Now I'm doing full welds all around, and you can see with the chalk I'm making marks because I don't want to do the whole inside in one sort of pass. And the reason for that is because this is introducing a tremendous amount of heat to the metal. And metal likes to warp on you if it gets too hot, especially when it's all tack welded and welded together. It's going to bend somehow, and I want to avoid that. So that's why I'm cutting this off into segments, and I'm doing segment here, segment there, keeping them away from each other before I go back and finish up the whole thing. Now these are just the legs, and they worked wonderfully. These are very, very solid legs, and I don't think I'll have any issue with them in the future. So what options can my company offer you when it comes to fire pits? Basically anything goes. If you want this to be taller, smaller, a box size, if you want different designs, of course here, that's easy enough to do. Any changes that you want to what you see here, not a problem whatsoever. Even with the legs, again, these are very, very solid legs. Even if they do rot, which I doubt, over the next couple of decades, it's easy to replace. And now that I know how to weld, I could just rebuild it however I want. The one thing I would like to do next time for the next fire pit, if I'm still alive when I make it, is to have this actually, this is nice and open like this, but I would like to have it maybe about half of that and have this part straight up instead. And what that would do is just allows you to see the graphics a little bit better when you're sitting there. Because you can see them here, here, and here, no problem at all. But this just happens to be the angle that you're sitting at and you don't really see it all that well. So it's just a small aesthetic thing. If you wanted a cover, steel cover to go over it, I plan on making that shortly. Additionally, if you wanted a grate to go over this, and you can do like hamburgers and that kind of stuff, totally possible. We can make that for you to whatever spec you want. Again, anything you want for a fire pit, we can make it, including round ones. Now this is the bottom grate that I want to make for the fire pit, and I buy my metal as sort of native as possible, meaning that like the angle iron here, I bought a 20-foot long section. And the reason for that is because you buy little sections of metal and then you have a project and there's always a little bit of metal left over and you're lucky. But more often than not, it goes the other way around and you just need like another inch. But because you bought it and you had the mill already cut it for you, then you need to go buy more metal. So I prefer to buy too much metal and to buy it as long as I possibly can, which is 20 feet in this case here. And from that, it works wonderfully for cutting into pieces and fabricating because I'm not worried about just needing one more inch here or there. To give you an idea of the weight, this thing here, I'd say it's around 20 to 25 pounds. And this thing here, I'd say it's around 100 pounds. It's really heavy. And when they're together, of course, it's not fun to lift. But if you wanted something lighter, all you have to do really is use thinner gauge. But again, then you're going into something that's not as durable as thicker gauge. Originally, I was going to make this at a 1/4 inch, but I wanted to try 3/8 and see what it was a nice medium between 3/8 and 1/8. And it actually works out pretty well. So we'll see how long that lasts. So looking for a custom fire pit designed however you want, contact me at CNCKing.com. We'll make it for you and ship it right to your door. And also, we can also just send you the parts if you want to spot weld or weld it yourself too. So that's totally optional.